The Arizona desert stretched endlessly under a merciless sun, waves of heat distorting the horizon like liquid glass. Sergeant James "Cactus" McKenna wiped the sweat from his brow as he adjusted his position atop the rocky outcrop overlooking the training grounds at Fort Huachuca. The year was 1943, and the Second World War was raging across two oceans. Here, in the brutal Southwest, American soldiers prepared for the hell that awaited them in North Africa. McKenna was different from the other gunners in his unit. While his comrades relied on standard military range-finding equipment, he had developed something the brass considered ridiculous: a makeshift rangefinder constructed from cactus spines, mirror fragments, and an old surveyor's compass he'd bought from a Tucson pawn shop. The other soldiers called it junk. His commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Hartford, called it insubordination. "You're embarrassing this unit, McKenna," Hartford had barked just that morning during inspection. "Your hillbilly contraption is a disgrace to the United States Army. When we deploy, you'll use regulation equipment like everyone else, or you'll find yourself cleaning latrines in Louisiana." McKenna said nothing. He never did. He just nodded, his jaw tight, his calloused hands gripping the device he'd spent 6 months perfecting. The son of a surveyor from Flagstaff, McKenna had grown up measuring distances across canyon walls and desert expanses. His father had taught him that precision wasn't about expensive tools, it was about understanding angles, light, and the land itself. But the Army didn't care about his background. They cared about conformity, about following protocol, about not making waves. McKenna was the son of a dirt-poor railroad worker who died in a track accident when James was 15. He joined the military to escape poverty, to prove he was more than the scrawny kid from the wrong side of the tracks. Instead, he found himself mocked, dismissed, treated like a fool with delusions of grandeur. The training exercise that afternoon would change everything, though McKenna didn't know it yet. The scenario was simple: identify and engage simulated enemy armor at various distances. The fastest and most accurate gunner would earn a recommendation for advanced artillery training, possibly even a transfer to a frontline unit heading to Europe or North Africa. McKenna's hands trembled slightly as he set up his cactus spine rangefinder. The device looked absurd: a tangle of thin spines arranged in a precise geometric pattern, each one calibrated to measure specific angles when aligned with the mirror shards. Other soldiers snickered as they passed his position. One man, Corporal Davies from Atlanta, stopped to laugh openly. "That gonna help you hit anything, country boy? Or you planning to poke the enemy to death with those needles?" McKenna ignored him, his eyes focused on the distant targets. 3 mock tank silhouettes sat at varying distances across the valley floor. Standard procedure was to use the Army-issued optical rangefinder, calculate the distance, relay it to the artillery crews, and wait for confirmation. It was a slow process, reliable but cumbersome. Lieutenant Colonel Hartford stood with his arms crossed beside the observation tower, his face a mask of skepticism. He'd brought several visiting officers from Fort Bliss to observe the exercise, and McKenna's participation was, in his words, a reluctant accommodation to avoid accusations of favoritism toward wealthier, better-connected soldiers. The whistle blew. Gunners scrambled to their positions. McKenna moved with quiet efficiency, aligning his cactus spines with the first target. The spines caught the sunlight at precise angles, creating reflection patterns in the mirror fragments that told him exactly what he needed to know. Distance: 1,847 yards. Elevation adjustment: 3 degrees. Wind correction: minimal, southwest breeze at 4 miles per hour. He called out his calculations to the simulated artillery crew, a set of observers with stopwatches recording response times. The other gunners were still fumbling with their equipment, adjusting dials and consulting range tables. McKenna was already moving to the second target. Distance: 2,203 yards. Elevation: 4 degrees. Wind: increasing to 6 miles per hour. The observers glanced at each other, surprised by his speed. Hartford's expression remained stony, unconvinced. The third target sat partially concealed behind a ridge, only the top third visible, a nightmare scenario for conventional range-finding equipment. McKenna adjusted his position, realigning the cactus spines. The geometry of the spines allowed him to calculate not just horizontal distance but vertical displacement, compensating for the hidden portion of the target. It was a technique his father had taught him for surveying partially obscured landmarks. Distance: 1,654 yards. Effective. Target elevation above grade: 23 feet. Correction: 2 degrees down angle. The final whistle blew. Results were tallied. McKenna's times were posted on the board. Fastest acquisition by 37 seconds. Accuracy 100% on all 3 targets. The next closest gunner had missed one completely and taken twice as long. Hartford stared at the numbers, his face reddening. The visiting officers murmured among themselves. Impressed. McKenna stood silent. His homemade rangefinder hanging from his belt like a badge of honor he wasn't allowed to wear. The humiliation came swiftly and publicly. Lieutenant Colonel Hartford dismissed the exercise results before the assembled unit that evening. His voice cold and sharp as a blade. Luck, he announced, his eyes fixed on McKenna. Nothing more than dumb luck and favorable conditions. Any fool can get lucky once. The other soldiers shifted uncomfortably. Even those who had mocked McKenna earlier knew what they'd witnessed wasn't luck. But Hartford wasn't finished. He stepped closer to McKenna, close enough that the sergeant could smell the coffee and cigarettes on his breath. Your little science project ends now, McKenna. Effective immediately, that contraption is confiscated. You'll use regulation equipment, or you'll be reassigned to supply duties. Do I make myself clear? McKenna's jaw clenched. Yes, sir. But Hartford wasn't satisfied with compliance. He needed to crush any notion that an uneducated farm boy could outperform men from West Point, from Yale, from families with military legacies stretching back generations. He snatched the Cactus spine rangefinder from McKenna's belt, holding it up for everyone to see. This is what happens when we lower our standards, gentlemen. When we allow anyone with a warm body to think they can innovate beyond established military doctrine. This device is dangerous, unreliable, and completely unsuitable for combat conditions. He threw it on the ground. The mirror fragments shattered. Several Cactus spines snapped. McKenna watched, his fists balled so tight his knuckles went white. But he said nothing. He couldn't afford to. One word of protest would mean a court-martial, the end of any chance he had to prove himself. That night, McKenna sat alone in the barracks while the other men played cards and wrote letters home. Corporal Davies approached, surprisingly somber. That wasn't right, what Hartford did. Everyone knows you earned those scores fair and square. McKenna stared at his hands, at the calluses from years of hard labor before the army, from months of crafting and calibrating his rangefinder. Doesn't matter what's right, he said quietly. Matters what the brass decides is right. Word spread quickly through Fort Huachuca. McKenna became a cautionary tale, proof that stepping outside the lines brought nothing but trouble. When deployment orders finally came 3 weeks later, McKenna was assigned to a reserve artillery unit, far from frontline action. Men with half his skill and twice his family connections received coveted positions in combat battalions heading to North Africa. The morning his unit was set to deploy to a support role in Texas, McKenna received an unexpected visitor. A weathered captain named Reynolds, recently returned from Tunisia, stood before him with an unusual request. I heard about what happened with Hartford. I also heard about your range-finding method. I'm assembling a special artillery unit for unconventional desert warfare. I need gunners who can think, not just follow manuals. Interested? McKenna looked up, hope flickering in his eyes for the first time in weeks. Where would we be going, sir? Reynolds smiled grimly. Somewhere your Cactus spines might just save American lives. Captain Reynolds didn't wait for official channels. Within 48 hours, McKenna found himself on a transport plane crossing the Atlantic, part of a hand-picked team of 12 gunners heading to North Africa. The mission briefing came mid-flight, shouted over the roar of engines. German Panzer divisions are cutting through our lines like butter, Reynolds explained, unrolling maps across a crate. Their armor is superior, their tactics are refined, and they know the desert better than we do. Our standard artillery response times are too slow. By the time conventional gunners calculate range and relay coordinates, the Panzers have repositioned. We're losing men because we can't adapt fast enough. He looked directly at McKenna. That's where you come in. I need gunners who can acquire targets in seconds, not minutes. Men who can improvise when equipment fails. Out there, your homemade methods aren't insubordination. They're survival. They landed in Casablanca under cover of darkness, then moved inland toward the Tunisian border, where Rommel's Afrika Korps had established defensive positions. The desert was nothing like Arizona. The sand was finer, the heat more oppressive, and the stakes infinitely higher. This wasn't practice. This was kill or be killed. McKenna rebuilt his rangefinder using materials scavenged from destroyed vehicles. Bent antenna wires instead of cactus spines, polished metal fragments instead of mirror shards, a damaged periscope lens he salvaged from a burned-out tank. It looked even more makeshift than the original, but the principles remained sound. Geometry didn't change just because the continent did. The other gunners in Reynolds' unit watched him work with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. These weren't privileged academy graduates. They were men like him. Rough, practical, survivors who'd learned warfare in the school of hard necessity. Slowly, grudgingly, they began to respect what he was building. On their fourth day in theater, the unit received word that a panzer column was moving through a valley 15 miles east. Standard reconnaissance suggested 8 tanks, possibly more, heading toward an undermanned American supply depot. Reynolds' unit was the only artillery support within range. "This is it," Reynolds said, his face grim. "This is what we came here to do." McKenna positioned himself on a ridge overlooking the approach route, his rebuilt rangefinder ready. His hands were steady now, all doubt burned away by the clarity of purpose. Below, American supply trucks scrambled to evacuate, but they wouldn't make it in time. The Panzers would reach them in minutes. Through the heat shimmer, McKenna spotted the first tank. Then the second. Then 6 more, rolling in formation like mechanical predators. They hadn't seen his position yet. They had no idea an American gunner was already calculating their destruction. If you're watching this and rooting for McKenna to prove everyone wrong, take a moment and subscribe to the channel. Because what happens next changed the course of his entire life, and the lives of every man in that supply convoy. McKenna aligned his improvised rangefinder, the desert sun catching the metal fragments at precise angles. Distance to lead tank, 3,420 yards. Fire mission, he called into the radio, his voice cold and certain. 8 targets. I have solutions. The first shell left the howitzer with a sound like thunder splitting the earth. McKenna didn't watch its arc. His eyes were already on the second Panzer, his hands adjusting the improvised rangefinder with movements so practiced they seemed instinctive. The mathematics flowed through his mind faster than conscious thought. Distance, wind speed, target velocity, barrel elevation. 3,420 yards. Correction for movement, southeast bearing. Fire. The first shell struck the lead Panzer directly on its turret. The explosion was massive, orange flame and black smoke erupting into the pristine desert sky. The German column halted immediately, crews scrambling to identify the threat. But McKenna was already calling coordinates for the third tank. "They still don't see us," Reynolds breathed beside him, binoculars pressed to his face. "How are you tracking them this fast?" McKenna didn't answer. There was no time for explanation. The Panzers were beginning evasive maneuvers now, spreading formation, seeking cover. Standard doctrine said to wait, recalculate, confirm new positions. McKenna ignored doctrine. His rangefinder caught the light. The angles told him everything he needed to know. Second target, repositioning northwest. Distance now 3,600 yards. Elevation up 2 degrees. Fire. Another hit. The second Panzer lurched sideways, its track destroyed, crew bailing out into the sand. The remaining 6 tanks opened fire toward the ridge, but their shots fell short. They were firing blind, hoping to suppress an enemy they couldn't locate. McKenna felt something shift inside him. All the years of being told he wasn't good enough, all the mockery and dismissal, all the crushing weight of being invisible in his own uniform, it evaporated like morning dew under that North African sun. Here, in the crucible of actual combat, his father's lessons meant everything. His improvised tools were saving lives. Third target attempting to flank east. Distance 3,200 yards. Fire. Fourth target, smoke deployment, bearing south-southwest. Distance 3,750. Fire. The shells fell with devastating precision. One after another, the Panzers died. German crews abandoned their vehicles, retreating on foot across the dunes. Within 11 minutes, McKenna had called fire missions that destroyed or disabled 8 German tanks without a single miss. The radio crackled with voices from the supply depot. "We're clear. Repeat, we're clear. Who the hell is up there?" Reynolds grabbed McKenna's shoulder, his grip tight with disbelief and pride. 8 for 8. Jesus Christ, McKenna. 8 for 8. The other gunners gathered around, staring at the burning wrecks in the valley below. One of them, a sergeant from Detroit named Kowalski, picked up McKenna's improvised rangefinder, examining it with new eyes. "Can you teach us how to build these?" he asked quietly. McKenna nodded, exhaustion and exhilaration washing over him in equal measure. "Yeah, I can teach you." Far away in Arizona, Lieutenant Colonel Hartford would eventually receive the after-action report. He would read it 3 times, his face darkening with each pass, before filing it away without comment. News of the engagement spread through Allied command like wildfire. 8 Panzers destroyed by a single gunner using improvised equipment. The story seemed impossible, yet the evidence lay smoldering in that Tunisian valley, witnessed by dozens of soldiers whose lives McKenna had saved. Within a week, Captain Reynolds received orders to expand his experimental artillery unit. McKenna was promoted to Master Sergeant and assigned to train incoming gunners in rapid target acquisition techniques. The Cactus spine method, as it became known despite having evolved beyond its original materials, was no longer dismissed as hillbilly nonsense. It was being studied by Army engineers. But the real vindication came on a cold morning in December when McKenna stood before a formation of officers at a temporary headquarters in Algiers. Among them, standing rigid and visibly uncomfortable, was Lieutenant Colonel Hartford. He'd been summoned to observe a demonstration of the new range-finding techniques being implemented across North African artillery units. McKenna didn't gloat. He simply did what he'd always done. He showed them the work. He explained the geometric principles his surveyor father had taught him, how natural materials could be calibrated to read angles and distances with remarkable precision, how speed in combat wasn't about expensive optics but about understanding the relationship between light, space, and mathematics. Hartford said nothing during the presentation. When it ended, he approached McKenna privately, away from the other officers. For a long moment, he simply stood there, the desert wind pulling at his uniform. "I was wrong," he finally said, the words clearly costing him something. "I thought maintaining standards meant enforcing conformity. I didn't understand that real standards are about results, not appearances." McKenna met his eyes. "With respect, sir, you weren't just wrong about the equipment. You were wrong about who deserved a chance to prove themselves." Hartford nodded slowly, accepting the rebuke. "For what it's worth, Sergeant, your methods are being incorporated into training manuals. Your name will be in them." The formal recognition came in early 1944. McKenna received the Silver Star for his actions at the Tunisian Valley, along with a field commission to second lieutenant. More importantly, his techniques were officially adopted by the Army's Field Artillery School. Hundreds of gunners would be trained in rapid range-finding methods that bore his fingerprints, saving countless lives in battles yet to come. Letters arrived from home, forwarded through military postal channels. His mother, who'd been widowed and struggling, wrote that she'd been interviewed by a newspaper in Flagstaff. "They called you a hero, James. Your father would have been so proud." But the moment that meant most came quietly, without fanfare. Corporal Davies, the man who'd mocked him at Fort Huachuca, now fought in the same theater. He found McKenna one evening near the mess tent. "I was an idiot back in Arizona," Davies said simply. "I judged you because you were different, because you didn't fit the mold." "I'm sorry." McKenna shook his hand. "We all make mistakes. What matters is what we do after." The war continued, brutal and unforgiving. But McKenna had found something more valuable than vindication. He'd found purpose, respect earned through action rather than granted by birth, and the knowledge that innovation could come from anywhere, even the poorest corners of Arizona. The war ended in 1945, but James McKenna's impact on military artillery practices lasted far beyond the final surrender. He returned to the United States not as the dismissed farm boy from Flagstaff, but as a decorated officer whose innovations had fundamentally changed how the Army approached field artillery. By 1948, McKenna had accepted a position at the Army's Field Artillery School in Fort Sill, Oklahoma. He wasn't behind a desk pushing papers. He was in the field, training the next generation of gunners, teaching them that creativity and adaptability were just as important as following regulations. His courses became legendary, mandatory training for any artillery officer heading to active duty. The textbook arrived in 1952, Advanced Field Artillery Techniques in Austere Environments, co-authored by now Major James McKenna. Inside, carefully illustrated diagrams showed how to construct range-finding equipment from materials available in any combat zone. The introduction acknowledged that some of the most important innovations in military history came not from laboratories or academies, but from soldiers who refused to accept that problems were unsolvable. Lieutenant Colonel Hartford, by then retired, sent McKenna a copy of the book with a handwritten note tucked inside. "You were right. I was blind. This old man learned an important lesson too late, but at least I learned it. Thank you for your service, and forgive an old fool his pride." McKenna kept the note in his desk drawer, a reminder that even the harshest critics could find redemption through humility. In 1956, McKenna retired from active duty with the rank of colonel. He returned to Arizona, to the desert that had shaped him, and opened a surveying business in Flagstaff. But he never stopped teaching. Local high schools invited him to speak about mathematics, physics, and the practical applications of geometry. He told students that their backgrounds didn't determine their futures, that poverty wasn't a life sentence, that innovation belonged to anyone willing to think differently. His mother lived to see him honored by the state of Arizona in 1963, a commemorative plaque installed at Fort Huachuca recognizing his contributions to military artillery. She held his hand during the ceremony, tears streaming down her weathered face. "Your father would be so proud," she whispered, "not just of what you accomplished, but of who you became." McKenna died in 1989 at the age of 72, surrounded by family in the same Flagstaff home where he'd grown up. His obituary ran in newspapers across the country, recounting the legend of the Apache gunner who destroyed 8 Panzers before they ever saw him coming, using nothing but desert ingenuity and his father's lessons about measuring distance. The Cactus spine range finder, reconstructed from his original notes, sits today in the Smithsonian Institution's military collection, a testament to the power of thinking beyond convention. Thank you so much for watching this story until the end. If James McKenna's journey inspired you, please hit that like button and leave a comment below telling us what part of his story resonated most with you. Subscribe to the channel for more incredible true stories of courage, innovation, and perseverance against all odds. And if you have suggestions for stories you'd like us to tell next, drop them in the comments. We read every single one. Until next time, remember, your background doesn't define your future. Your determination does.